Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Kira Zeidelman with NARUC, welcoming you to our Subcommittee on Clean Coal and Carbon Management webinar on the Section 45Q tax credits for carbon capture and storage. We'll get started in just a minute. If Commissioner Oden is on, could you unmute yourself? All right, I'm not sure he's able to log on just yet, so I'll just briefly welcome everyone to the webinar. This is organized through the NARUC Subcommittee on Clean Coal and Carbon Management. Some of our upcoming activities in a couple weeks on April 10th, we're going to have a follow-up to this webinar where we'll be talking again about the tax credits, but we'll be hearing from some industry speakers to give their perspective on how the tax credit changes impact project economics. We are also going to be having a subcommittee site visit to Bismarck, North Dakota from May 16th through 18th. And we do have funding available thanks to our partnership with the Department of Energy to cover travel costs for commissioners. So if any commissioners are interested in attending this trip, please contact me and I will follow up with details about making your travel arrangements. So with that, let me pass it over. My thanks to Doug Scott and Brad Crabtree from the Great Plains Institute for helping to put together today's webinar. So go ahead, guys.
Thanks, Kara. This is Doug. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and to all of our distinguished commissioners and staff and friends on the phone. Really glad to be with you. I'm Doug Scott with the Great Plains Institute. I'm joined today by my GPI colleague, Brad Crabtree, by Matt Fry of the Wyoming Governor's Office, and Frank Farmer of the Mississippi Public Service Commission. This is the third webinar we've done for you in conjunction with the state CO2 EOR deployment work group, which is a gathering of 14 states trying to promote policies to help drive CO2 capture projects. Now, since we last talked, it's very exciting. The United States Congress has passed and the President has signed legislation to amend Section 45Q of the tax code for carbon capture projects. Next slide. Oh, there you go. That one's good. So for today's topics, we're going to talk about the 45Q reform, then the recently introduced Use It Act, as well as talk about additional federal policies for carbon capture, which could drive even more development. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the background of the state CO2 EOR deployment work group. I mentioned it earlier. There's always room for additional states in that work group if folks are interested in that. And then look at some of the work group infrastructure and ethanol recommendations, because these are a couple of very important pieces to the funding and deployment puzzle to drive additional projects. And then look at some regional carbon capture deployment initiatives, a new initiative by the state work group working a lot of work that had been done by DOE before, and DOE is still in that space, but the state work group wanted to take advantage and try to drive some projects to promote economic development as well as carbon capture. So first we're going to hear from Brad Crabtree. Brad has worked on the issue of carbon capture for a number of years. He facilitated the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which has recently been rechristened as the Carbon Capture Coalition, designed to try to move these kind of projects forward and help get federal legislation passed, which, as I mentioned, has recently happened. So Brad's going to talk about that. He is a leading national expert on this subject. So Brad, why don't you tell us the good news?
Great, thank you, Doug, and thank you, Kira, commissioners and staff, for the opportunity to join you today. It was years in coming, and the reform of the Section 45Q tax credit, as Doug noted, occurred in early February. It was wrapped into the Bipartisan Budget Act. It's worth noting that the Future Act, which is the Senate legislation that was incorporated into the Budget Act, had a quarter of the United States Senate sponsoring it, 6 Republicans, 18 Democrats, and 1 independent. And needless to say, there's very few bills these days that have that kind of bipartisan support, which speaks to the opportunity more broadly of carbon capture to appeal to a diverse, range of interests and constituencies. So the Future Act was incorporated with almost no revisions into the Bipartisan Budget Act. Most importantly, it increases the value of the existing 45Q tax credit, which was well-intentioned but never functioned as intended. For CO2 stored through enhanced oil recovery, it is a tax credit, I should say, for CO2 storage or the beneficial use of CO2. So when that CO2 is stored through enhanced oil recovery, the credit value will increase over the next 10 years from $10 to $35 per metric ton. For CO2 stored in other geologic formations, which would be principally saline reservoirs, that value will increase from $20 to $50 per ton. And the rationale for the difference in credit value there is that when you store CO2 in a saline formation, you don't have the opportunity to sell the CO2 to an oil company, so there's less revenue involved. And then finally, there's an entire new application for the new 45Q tax credit, which is to incentivize the beneficial use of CO2 as a building block or feedstock to produce energy, chemicals, or useful products while reducing emissions. And so the CO2 tax credit in that case would be applied to the tons of CO2 emissions that are reduced in the case of beneficial utilization. The other thing that the tax credit does, which is vitally important, a tax credit ought to attract private capital to be invested in economic activities that otherwise might not occur. And the original 45Q from the get-go lacked financial certainty and therefore did not fulfill that purpose of drawing private capital into carbon capture. So under the Future Act, now the tax credit will be extended for a 6-year period from the enactment of the bill in February. And any capture project that commences construction within that 6-year period will by statute qualify for the tax credit. And then the time period to claim the tax credit once a carbon capture project enters commercial operation is 12 years rather than 10. And so that extra 2 years is actually a significant benefit in terms of financing carbon capture projects. There are also some other applications of the new 45Q that are different. I mentioned beneficial utilization of CO2 as a feedstock, but also it allows the direct air capture technologies where CO2 is being captured from the atmosphere itself to qualify for the tax credit, as well as the capture of carbon monoxide. And I should say there, the reason for that is that there are certain industrial applications where carbon monoxide is the emission and the emitter is required to flare the carbon monoxide, which ultimately results in CO2 emissions. By allowing for carbon monoxide capture, the carbon monoxide can be then utilized again as a feedstock for beneficial use. The other area that's critically important is the eligibility threshold for facilities has been reduced from 500,000 metric tons in the case of industrial sources of CO2 to 100,000 tons. There were entire industries where most facilities were ruled out under the old 45Q because they don't generate that much CO2. Prominent examples include ethanol production, fertilizer production, for example, gas processing in many cases. So by lowering that threshold, it both expands the number of facilities eligible for the tax credit, but importantly also expands the geography for the deployment of carbon capture and CO2 pipelines. It's worth noting that on the electricity side, the threshold remains at the original 500,000 tons. Finally, and this is often overlooked in the discussion, but it's really important, not all developers of carbon capture projects have the ability to effectively monetize a tax credit. We've seen that with wind energy projects and solar energy projects. Obviously, if you have an electric cooperative or municipal utility, the challenge is obvious. They're not taxpayers in the sense of a C corporation. But also many project developers simply lack the tax appetite to fully monetize the tax credit. So under the new legislation, the recipient of the tax credit will be the owner of the carbon capture equipment. That will actually open the door to all kinds of different business models that weren't possible under the previous legislation, and also to tax partnerships with companies that are involved in a project. The other thing the legislation allows is for the owner of the carbon capture equipment to assign the tax credit to someone else in the value chain managing the CO2. So it could be potentially a pipeline company or enhanced oil recovery operator, an oil company could take the tax credit if they have greater tax appetite. Next slide. So we can, in the question and answer, we can talk about the changes to 45Q and their significance if folks have questions, but there's also more work to be done. First and foremost, when legislation passes, as you know, you still have to implement the law. And in this case, the Department of the Treasury will be responsible for issuing guidance. And so the Carbon Capture Coalition, which Doug referenced, will be working closely with Treasury and monitoring the development of the guidance and providing input. Also, like we have seen with wind energy, solar energy, energy efficiency, and other low and zero carbon energy options, one deployment incentive is not enough. It's important that, like these other technologies, carbon capture has a range of public policy supporting it. So there are complementary federal incentives that would help in the financing of carbon capture projects. The two that are most focused on at the moment are making tax-exempt private activity bonds eligible for carbon capture projects. That would allow states with allocations of PABs to choose carbon capture projects to benefit from tax-free debt. Also, master limited partnerships are a number of energy technologies and infrastructure are currently eligible for MLPs, but carbon capture projects are not. And so legislation now before Congress, bipartisan legislation would make carbon capture eligible for the tax and tax benefits of MLPs and the ability to raise equity on public markets. The other thing that we are going to be focusing on as a coalition is making sure that the federal infrastructure legislation that's now under development incorporates CO2 pipeline infrastructure as part of that broader package, and also providing financing and other support for the deployment of the pipeline infrastructure that will be necessary to complement carbon capture and the 45Q tax credit. Finally, the deployment incentive in 45Q was both essential and urgent. We needed a policy like that to start to see projects move forward. But looking ahead now, there's a new generation of carbon capture technologies that are in the R&D phase that will be very important for reasons of cost and efficiency to have them reach the marketplace. So there's support for, we'll be providing support for the DOE budget and appropriations for capture, utilization, and storage programs that are run through the Office of Fossil Energy. Next slide. Finally, with infrastructure being a new focus for policy development on carbon capture, The first legislation that we've been anticipating has now been introduced. It was introduced just last week. The same foursome that introduced the Future Act in the Senate, Senator Barrasso of Wyoming, a Republican, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, a Democrat, Capito, Republican from West Virginia, and Heitkamp, a Democrat from North Dakota, have teamed up again, and they've introduced the, I want to make sure I say it right here, the, I thought we had the acronym listed anyway. I'm realizing here we don't have Utilizing Significant Emissions Through Innovative Technologies Act. That's a mouthful. The point of the Use It Act, though, is to do four basic things. One is to make sure that CO2 pipelines are eligible under the FAST Act, which was a bipartisan legislation that was widely supported. Also, Matt will be talking about this, but establishing an interagency process through the Council on Environmental Quality to develop permitting guidance for capture, utilization, and pipeline projects, and doing that in the context of the various federal statutes that affect these projects. Also, having CEQ establish some regional task forces to overcome some of the inertia we've seen in terms of working with states, tribes, and stakeholders to develop, permit, and site and permit pipeline corridors, especially those that cross state lines and those that involve federal lands. And then this is separate from the role of CO2 pipeline infrastructure, but Senator Barrasso and Senator Whitehouse in particular are supporters of direct air capture technology, and so they have both demonstration and research funding in the bill to support that technology. What we're excited about is the state work group, the 14 state work group that Doug referenced, and that that our speakers are all involved in today. This legislation includes 2 of the 3 core recommendations on CO2 pipeline infrastructure that were made by the work group in February of last year. And that's, again, making sure that CO2 pipelines are part of the infrastructure package that's emerging on Capitol Hill, but also having the federal government play a more proactive role in planning, siting, and developing pipeline corridors and projects. So I think that's my last slide, Doug. Yep.
Yep, thanks, Brad. So next we're going to hear from Frank Farmer. Frank is General Counsel to the Mississippi PSC. We've been able to work with Frank on a number of projects, and he's jumped right in and adds a lot to the processes. So we're really glad he's with us today. So Frank, you want to talk to us about the state CO2 EOR deployment work group? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Doug. As you mentioned, I'm here in Mississippi. And excited to be part of this group, and we appreciate all of your interest in the work going on in this space as well. As was noted before, this issue has broad bipartisan support, and it was originally conceived by Governors Meade and Governor Bullock of Montana, and that's one Republican and one Democrat, and I believe Mississippi has been involved since pretty close to the beginning, back in 2005. As they've noted, it's expanded to a group of approximately 14 states, and I'll repeat the call for anyone to join who would like to be part of it. But it's not just states. There are industry leaders who work in this space, and as well as our experts who we couldn't work without. And all of those participants meet variously to advance this topic. And just in 2017, as the slide indicates, the working group has released a number of papers. Putting the puzzle pieces together made some recommendations in that paper, and I believe that's on the next slide. So if we'll move to that one. making some recommendations. And just as a side note, it's not all governor's offices or public service commissions. There are various participants from various parts of state government, at least from the state players' perspectives, that just make it fit for the interests of that area. But this larger report released back in 2016 made some recommendations, and we're happy that the 45Q tax credit was taken up very recently. That was a very long road with lots of effort to try and get states to sign on to that, to encourage the Congress to pass those tax credits and make them something that we can use moving forward, as opposed to having them just kind of fizzle out and therefore stifle the innovation and work that could be done in this area. So one of the recommendations of that putting the puzzle together paper was to extend and reform those tax credits, which we're thankful has been done. A second one was deploying a more revenue neutral mechanism to stabilize the price paid for CO2 and carbon capture project revenue, and that just generally removing volatility and investment risk associated with these projects to stabilize that market. And then finally, offering those tax-exempt private activity bonds and master limited partnerships that Brad mentioned earlier to help provide project financing on better terms. Those were the big federal recommendations. And then, of course, there's things that we can do closer to home that are important to get these projects off the ground and sustain them. Sales tax on equipment purchases is the first one listed on your slide. Property taxes, sales taxes on equipment acquired to adapt an oil field to these sorts of operations, and various oil and gas taxes, such as the production and severance taxes. These are all things that have a material effect on what the December paper framed as putting all these pieces of the puzzle together. They work together from the state and the federal perspective to make sure that we can advance this, as we discussed, bipartisan agenda. If you can look at the next slide. One of the things that Brad also mentioned was making sure that this work is part of that infrastructure debate. You know, infrastructure is not just roads and bridges. This is an important piece of what can be a broadly supported and an important part of the future infrastructure policy of the United States. And that's just one of these things that this 45Q tax credit can put together. The master limited partnerships, the private activity bonds, all of that plays a role in all of the legislation that we need to pass and that we need to, regulations that we need to implement in order to get the ball rolling. So the 45Q tax credit really helps bring all of these things together. If the time frame as they existed before weren't expanded, it was effectively, while not expired, it was effectively expired, and nobody was going to take advantage of this, and there was no incentive to move it forward, at least from the tax perspective. And we're glad that the 45Q tax credit now extended breathes new life and energy into projects that can really both capture that carbon and store it, sequester it in the ground, while increasing oil production in the United States from formerly thought to be fallow fields, and also the employment opportunities that all of these things create. So I guess I just kind of blew through my slides, but that's a background of the work, why we got started, who we are, and what we've been focused on up to this point.
Great. Thank you, Frank. We really appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Matt Fry. Matt, as I mentioned earlier, is from the office of Wyoming Governor Matt Mead. Matt has co-chaired the state working group and has done a great job with that. As you heard, Governor Mead was one of the two governors who got the group started, and Matt has really been instrumental in all of the large body of work that the group has turned out in the last couple of years. So great to have you with us today, Matt, and take it away.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, commissioners and staff, for having us on here again today to talk with you. I'm just going to follow up in kind of the order of our reports that we presented from the work group, and the next one that we did after the puzzle pieces report was one on pipeline infrastructure recommendations. We felt like this was pretty important. Actually, it's critical to the CCUS development space, as honestly, pipelines are a significant hindrance or obstacle in development of CCUS projects. It's kind of the chicken and the egg discussion. Why would I build a CCUS technology if I can't transport the CO2? And then the pipeline folks say, why would I develop a pipeline project if I don't have any way of capturing the CO2? So we're looking at this as more of a holistic way. So logically, we followed up with some pipeline recommendations. This report suggested 3 primary recommendations to facilitate pipeline infrastructure development. The first of which was to make CO2 pipelines a priority component of the broader national infrastructure agenda. Brad touched on that earlier. We've been lucky and seen that implemented or introduced in the new Use It Act from Senator Barrasso and the co-sponsors on that. Our second recommendation was to leverage private capital with federal financing. Kind of the history behind this is the reality is there's an economic gap between price of CO2 and cost of pipeline development. So we make a pretty strong case to rationalize federal financing or federal incentives for financing pipelines to kind of bring in that private capital. And we suggest it in a way that's either very low cost or no cost to the federal government. And then our final recommendation, or final primary recommendation, was to support CO2 pipeline corridor planning and permitting. I work on a project for the governor where I'm trying to develop an interstate pipeline corridor system. And I've been working on that for over 4 years just within Wyoming. That experience, as well as experiences from a number of other people over decades of developing pipelines, makes it pretty much common sense to come to the conclusion that we need a better system to plan and permit these, because they take too long, and it kind of reduces the financial assurances of these companies that bring these projects forward. So with that, I'll go to the next slide. In addition to the recommendations of the work group for incentives, we also looked at or kind of described the benefits of developing pipeline corridors and how much impact this could have on CCUS deployment. If you look at this map, obviously these are not sited and well-planned arrows, and that was done intentionally, just so we didn't step on any toes. But kind of the theory here is that these theoretical corridors and the dark blue lines could facilitate substantial CCUS deployment by bringing CO2 from these sources to sinks. Facilitating that development would obviously be of economic benefit and all the other benefits associated with CCUS. So this is just a theoretical model of opportunities to take large quantities of CO2 from source to sink. Next slide. After the pipeline infrastructure report, we felt it made a lot of sense to build off of that with a report on CO2 capture and use from ethanol. Kind of the rationale behind this is ethanol provides a fairly low cost and readily available source of CO2 that can be used. also centralized. You know, the ethanol industry is central to the country, so it provides a lot of opportunity to capture that CO2 in central locations and then disperse it kind of in a wagon spoke sort of way to the sinks across the country that can utilize it either for EOR or other industrial feedstocks or just for saline storage. Once again, the problem with this idea is that we lack pipeline infrastructure. We have an extremely valuable, worthy source of CO2. We just don't have the opportunity to get it to market. So the work group decided to take a look at that. So with that, next slide, please. So with that limiting factor in mind, which was pipelines, the members of the work group developed some models to describe two different scenarios and what these economics of those scenarios would look like. The first scenario provides projections for pipelines that capture CO2 from 15 different ethanol plants, and in turn would transport that CO2 to oil fields in Kansas. So just simple numbers here, we looked at about 737 miles of pipeline, which would transport about 4.3 million tons of CO2 per year. Next slide, please. The next scenario, scenario 2, provided a projection of a larger system. Here we looked at capturing CO2 from 34 ethanol plants, and in turn transporting that CO2 to oil fields in the Permian, which, as I'm sure you're well aware, has a pretty large appetite for CO2. Just simple numbers on this, the scale, about 1,550 miles of pipeline, which would deliver just under 10 million tons per year CO2 to the Permian. Next slide, please. So based on those modeling results, as you can see in the table up above, these are the CO2 prices for the different scenarios that we would need to make this viable. We don't have the actual prices of CO2 down, but Brad, can you help me? It's about $25 a ton now, right?
Yeah, that depends on the location. If you're in the Permian, that's probably a good price. If you're in some other regions that are further from a place to put the CO2, you'd probably be closer to 15.
Okay. So what we were trying to get at with this table is there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's an economic gap between the potential to transport this or transport this CO2 and use it, as well as earn a rate of return on that. So the justification and the rationale for this table is we used two real-life, real-world examples of potential projects to utilize CO2 in an effort to justify a recommendation for federal incentives to build out these pipelines and utilize the CO2 in an actually advantageous way. Next slide, please. So after we finished these reports, we started looking at some opportunities to do something different. We had the 45Q tax credit implemented, and that touched on our first and most important recommendation of the work group. And so in conversation with the governor, we decided it was time to start looking, maybe going potentially a different way. The reality is we've got 6 years to commence construction on projects to capture this 45Q credit. So what the governor's directed us to do is start looking at a mechanism to get projects on the ground. We want to turn some dirt and build some projects and start capturing and utilizing the CO2 so we can all benefit from it. So that kind of led us into the work group's next initiative. So that's the next slide. And this is what we're kind of calling, just from simplistic terms, a regional CCUS deployment initiative. This slide describes simply what we're planning to do. It's going to be using a three-phased approach where we'll identify and analyze potential regional opportunities to capture CO2, transport it for use, and then permanently store it. I'm not going to read through the slides. You guys can see that very well, but we understand that at large scale, we as a work group don't have the potential or the capability to actually permit these projects. But what we want to do is look for opportunities and help facilitate this development so we can get some projects on the ground. And just to emphasize the importance of this initiative, Governor Meade a few weeks ago sent a letter out to 17 governors across the country, all of whom have an interest in CO2 and EOR and CCUS and things of that nature, and asked for their active participation and support in this work. Many of those governors are in the work group, but not all are. So as Doug, Brad, and Frank mentioned earlier on, we're willing and interested in adding to this work group. Any state that wants to come to the table and participate, we're happy to have you, and we'd be happy to utilize your expertise. So with that, I believe that takes care of my slides. Turn it back over to Doug.
All right, Matt, thanks very much. And so just, in summary, I don't want to underestimate, how important 45Q was. I mean, that was huge to get that. But as everybody has said, there's a lot more work that still needs to be done, whether that's the regulation, implementation, and other pieces of the puzzle that everybody has laid out. I think pipelines is a huge part of that, as the broader federal infrastructure policy. And developing pipeline corridors and projects. The private activity bonds, master limited partnerships, and DOE loan fund can all help play a part in all of this, including financing for extra CO2 pipeline capacity that a couple of our speakers have talked about. And then, the work at the state and regional level becomes very important because there are a lot of projects, a lot of industry out there that could use the captured CO2. It could also be used for enhanced oil recovery. And so, being able to help develop some of those other projects becomes very important. So there's a lot of work that's still left to be done. And but getting the legislation passed and signed by the president was a tremendous and necessary first step for all of this to happen. So very exciting time for carbon capture project possibilities. We think there will be a number of projects moving forward, and looking forward to talking with you about them as they arise. And with that, we have about, I believe, about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for questions. So happy to take them.
Yeah, thank you. So I see we have a couple of questions coming in. James Branscombe, can you go ahead? James, I think I've unmuted you, but you may still have muted yourself. All right, James, I'm afraid we still can't hear you. So you can try entering your question in the question box. Amber Leonard, did you have a question? Okay, perhaps not. And Commissioner Johnson, go ahead.
Yeah, you might have covered this, but I was wondering about the 45Q tax credit, and you mentioned Treasury. Now, does DOE, does it play a significant role in the implementation, or is it just Treasury?
Brad, you want to take that one?
Yeah, this is Brad Crabtree. Commissioner, DOE has a consultative role, but given the issues around the regulatory definition of secure geologic storage, the 45Q tax credit is a tax credit for secure geologic storage. EPA is the agency responsible for the underground injection program. So in a relative sense, I think EPA will have more input into the guidance than DOE, not because that's by design. I just think it's the nature of what needs to be. The other aspect of the new 45Q is that I mentioned that it creates this this new category of beneficial utilization, and it will be EPA's responsibility to define the life cycle analysis for the applications that qualify. And so I think Treasury will look significantly to EPA for that as well.
Thank you.
And this is Kira again. I had a follow-up question from Commissioner Fornstrom on that. She was wondering about the timing and the status of the regulations coming out of Treasury, and what other stakeholders are working to assist in crafting those regulations.
Commissioner, this is Brad Crabtree again. I don't think, and I could be wrong about this, I don't think there is a required time frame. There is an interest on the part of the companies and other organizations that worked with the members of Congress to get the legislation passed to have this process move as quickly as possible. I've heard folks talk about having something in the form of guidance by the end of the year. And Kira, I'm sorry, there was another part to the question in addition to timing.
Other outside groups that are helping to craft those regulations or kind of commenting in the process?
Right. Well, so obviously, as with any federal proceeding, everybody is able and welcome to provide input. And I suspect that some of the companies that are most committed to deploying carbon capture projects or as customers of CO2 for oil production or utilization will be weighing in individually. I can say that the Carbon Capture Coalition is going to comment formally and together, hopefully on a consensus basis. And we would be happy to work with commissioners and others in that process, not necessarily in having commissioners join private stakeholders in their comments, but in terms of discussing concerns or issues that might be arising and how to address them. So I'd welcome Commissioner, you and any others reaching out to be involved in those discussions.
Great, and I'm just going to read another question. A few have come through the question box. Daniel Lefevers from the Gas Technology Institute wanted to ask, will the capture of carbon dioxide at ethanol plants for enhanced oil recovery change the value of the ethanol as it relates to the renewable fuel standard? I know that the RFS has been kind of in the news a little bit recently with Senator Cruz kind of coming up with potentially a new policy for that.
Doug, do you want me to start and see if others have something to add?
Sure.
Or
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brad.
So I can't speak specifically to the RFS and the effect this will have on the RFS. I can say this relates to your question. With the capture of biogenic CO2 from fermentation, ethanol producers will directly be able to improve their carbon intensity scores in terms of existing low carbon fuels standard policies, especially in California. I won't get into the methodology. It's complex for calculating carbon intensity. But my memory is that by capturing biogenic CO2, you have the potential to improve a carbon intensity score by about 25 points, which is very large, which will, depending on how the low carbon fuel standard policies are implemented by California and other states, will allow ethanol producers to earn more credits from the sale of their fuels into states that have those policies. So that's part of the other interest in the ethanol industry that's driving their participation in this policy. It's not just the 45Q tax credit, it's the ability to provide an even lower carbon fuel into these regulated markets.
Great. I'm going to try to unmute Joshua Learn from S&P Global. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, there was some talk about, hi guys, the think I've spoken to some of you before. Anyways, there was some talk of pipelines connecting ethanol producing plants to enhanced oil recovery opportunities. You guys mentioned, just wanted to know if there was any plans to connect areas where there's coal plants and coal-fired generation that could be fitted with CCS to enhanced oil opportunities, other than those, you know, at Petronova and stuff that are already out there.
Matt, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. I can't speak directly with names or anything, but in Wyoming, we're currently having discussions with between 2 to 3 companies who are interested in potential projects on coal-fired power plants, and which would utilize that CO2 for EOR, as well as an additional technology for CO2 capture and EOR. So, yeah, I believe 45Q moved up some people's timelines and made some people a lot more interested in these CCUS projects on power plants. So, can't speak for other states, but I know there's stuff going on in Wyoming.
Great,
And
thank
Josh,
you.
this is Brad. Just to say, there are a number of us involved in the coalition that are hearing similar things from other places. Again, nothing's public yet, but very significant change in perspective and interest in, as Matt said, accelerated timeframes.
Great, thanks.
And I had a question come in from Gene Schaefer, who's asking about the whether the group is considering the usefulness of the Regulatory Certainty Act sponsored by Senator Hoeven with a companion bill in the House to try to align the reporting definitions of the EPA and the IRS.
Brad, you want to grab that one?
Well, I will, but I think it's important that Matt also speak to this.
Sure.
He's very aware of this issue. In this case, let me respond from the context of the Carbon Capture Coalition, not on behalf of the state work group, because the state work group didn't get involved in the regulatory issues associated with 45Q. There was not consensus on that policy among the various stakeholders in the Carbon Capture Coalition, including within industry. Some oil companies, for example, EOR operators, are strongly supporting that legislation. There are others that are not. There's mixed views among some of the companies that would supply CO2 to the oil industry for EOR. And then there's a significant difference of views also among environmental groups and between the various companies and environmental organizations. So in the end, that lack of consensus, the coalition never engaged in support of the bill, didn't take a position one way or another in deference, to the different views in the group. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I'll just speak to it briefly. As Brad mentioned, there's not a whole lot of consensus on this issue. So from the state work group perspective, we decided not to address it because since it's kind of a polarizing issue, we wanted to look at things that we could get full bore support on, which we've done with 2 pieces of legislation here. So rather than touch this one and make it a volatile issue, we chose to just to stay around it. With the rationale basically is it's not a broadly held concern, and at least from my perspective, it's not one that's been fully tested. So kind of our thought was that we'll bring forward the opportunities for businesses to develop this CCUS stuff through for financial incentives and so forth. And then this issue, if it truly is one, will work itself out on the back end. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Thank you. And Gene also had a follow-up question about whether North Dakota has been participating or approached for the state working group?
Brad, you want that one, or you want me to?
Why don't you go ahead, Matt, and I can add anything if.
Sure. Yeah, they are now participating as of what, 2 meetings ago, Brad?
That's correct.
Yeah. So the North Dakota does have a participant at the table as well. We Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and Saskatchewan just recently signed an MOU to agree to move forward with CCUS opportunities. So North Dakota is definitely an active player at this point.
It just occurred to me, Matt, but worth mentioning too, that Governor Burgum was one of the 6 governors, along with your governor, to join on that letter to Congress, calling on Congress to pass 45Q. So that was significant as well.
Brad, did you want to mention the other 4 who signed that?
Yeah, sorry. Governor of Kansas, Governor Collier of Kansas, Governor Bullock of Montana, Governor Wolf of Pennsylvania. Matt, help me. I'm suddenly. Governor Fallon of Oklahoma were right. Along with Governor Meade and Governor Burgum were the 6.
Thanks. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Yeah, I suddenly was trying to think about the map in my head.
And if I could ask a question, I thought there was some news in the last couple of weeks. FERC decided that it would no longer allow oil and gas pipeline MLPs to recover income tax allowance in cost of service rates. Does that have any bearing on your recommendations about using MLPs to speed the development of carbon dioxide pipelines?
I think I have to take that one, and unfortunately, my honest answer is I don't know. I saw the same trade press coverage you're referring to, Kira, and we're going to be having a call later this week with some folks that know much more about MLPs as a business structure and what that decision, what the implications might be. I don't know if there's anyone else who can speak to that. I can't responsibly offer an opinion.
I think what we could do though, Brad, is take a look at that and then bring an answer back to the next webinar on the 10th.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, that would be great. And with that, I'll give folks one last chance to raise your hand or submit a question in the question box. But I'd just like to thank Frank and Matt and Doug and Brad for volunteering their time for this webinar and addressing us about all of the state working groups products and advocacy. And we're obviously very excited about 45Q and looking forward to that next webinar. So I'll be posting the slides as well as the recording of this webinar on the NARUC website, www.naruc.org. And I'll also email out an invitation for our next webinar on April 10th. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I hope to see you all again in a few weeks to discuss this topic from another perspective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kira.
Thanks, Kira.
Thank you. All right, thanks.
Thanks, Frank.
Sure.
Thanks,